The last set of options that we'll look at in this series of videos on graph customization are going to be found within the Format Axes dialog. If you've been following along with the other videos in this series, we're going to continue with the bar graph that we started in the prior video that explored the Format Graph dialog. If you're just starting here, you can download a Prism file with this graph included so that you can follow along in this video. Once you're on the graph sheet, we'll bring up the Format Axes dialog by either double-clicking on one of the axes directly, which will bring up options for that specific axis, or by clicking on the Format Axes button in the Change section of the toolbar. If you use the Format Axes toolbar button, you'll be shown the first tab of this dialog, the Frame and Origin tab. Using the options here, you can define a number of features about the shape, size, and appearance of the graph and plotting area. Starting with the Origin section, you can choose where to set the origin of your graph, that is, where the X and Y axes cross. If we use the automatic setting, the location of the origin may change depending on the data on your graph. Generally, it's most obvious when using a mix of positive and negative values, as the default for the origin of a graph is usually at the coordinates 0, 0. For our graph, we could choose to show the origin at the lower right corner of the graph. Or we could use a custom setting, in which the x-axis intersects the y-axis at y equals 50, the same value that we'd used as our baseline for our bars in the previous video. For now, let's just set the origin to lower left. The next section provides tools for customizing the shape, size, and position of your graph. The default shapes for Prism graphs include tall, with an aspect ratio of 2:3, wide, with an aspect ratio of 3:2, and square, an aspect ratio of equal width and height. However, you can also define your own shape using custom. Note that if you're using one of Prism's default shapes, changing one dimension, either width or height, to a specific value of your choice will automatically change the other value to maintain the assigned shape or aspect ratio. In this section, you're also able to define the location of your graph on the page by specifying the distance of each axis from a specific edge of the page. The Axes and Colors section is fairly straightforward, allowing you to adjust the thickness and color of the axes and providing color options for the color of the plotting area defined by the space within the axes, and the page background, which is the entire workspace on the graph sheet. If you watched the other videos in this mini-series, you may recall that you could also set these colors using the Colors button in the toolbar. Both approaches yield the same result. The last section on this tab, the Frame and Gridlines tab, gives you customization options for adding a frame as well as major and minor gridlines to the graph. Under Frame Style, let's choose Frame with Tics Inward. We could also choose to show or hide any combination of X and Y axes, which is useful sometimes when you only need one axis. But in our case, we'll just leave it to show both X. For major gridlines, we could choose to turn them on for either the X or Y axes, or both. Let's turn on the major gridlines for the Y axis. Let's change their color to a middle shade of gray, adjust their thickness to 1/2, and set the style to a dashed line. Now, clicking Apply, we'll display these grid lines at the major ticks on the y-axis. You could do the same for minor grid lines if you'd like, but this is usually more useful with large scatter plots where major and minor grid lines can help you more accurately determine the value of any given point, and the process for customizing minor grid lines is identical for major grid lines. For now, we'll move on. The next three tabs of the Format Axes dialog are all very similar, and provide customization options for the x-axis, the left y-axis, and the right y-axis if your graph has one. You could also access these options directly by double-clicking on the desired axis on the graph. Because we're working with a bar graph, the x-axis options are limited, as many of these options are determined by the number of datasets shown on the graph. So we'll explore these various axis options by using the left y-axis tab. For different types of graphs, say for example the XY graph that we made in the first video in this series, the options we explore for the y-axis can be applied to the x-axis as well. The first options we see are Gaps and Direction and Scale. Under Gaps and Direction, we could choose Reverse instead of Standard. You can see that the y-axis now has 0 at the top, with values increasing as you move down the axis. You can also choose to create an axis break using 2 segments or 3 segments. Doing this would require you to define the proportion of the total axis length that each segment takes up, and the range of values in each segment. We won't explore the details of this feature in this video, but using axis breaks can be very useful when you have many data sets that span a wide range of values. For now, we'll just set it back to standard. Another useful feature for dealing with data spanning a very large range of values, or data on a unique scale, is the scale dropdown. Depending on the nature of the values being graphed, you can choose to change this scale to log base 10, log base 2, or to a probability axis in either percent or decimal. Note that this doesn't change the values of the data on the graph, merely where they appear in the plotting area, as the relative scale of distances on the axis will change depending on the selection here. In order to make changes to the next section of options, you'll need to uncheck the box Automatically Determine the Range and Interval. By default, Prism will use the data being plotted on the graph to make a decision as to a reasonable set of parameters for the options in these sections, but you're always able to come in and adjust them manually. We know from our annotations that the smallest mean value on the graph is 24.4, and the largest mean value is 93.4. Thus, instead of using a range that goes from 0 to 150, we could narrow the range of y-axis values to focus in on our set of values and set our minimum to 10 and our maximum to 110. When we click Apply, we see that the bars now take up more space on the graph due to the range of the y-axis being more closely centered on our data. In the next section, we can customize the appearance of the ticks displayed on the axis. We can specify the direction from the axis that the axis ticks will point, the length of the ticks, and the positioning and orientation of the numbers on the axis. Let's choose right for tick direction, short for tick length, and left vertical for the direction of numbering. It may be difficult to see since we have major grid lines turned on, but the ticks are now pointed to the right and the axis numbers have been repositioned and oriented vertically. In the next section of this tab, we can define the spacing and frequency of both the major and minor ticks and customize the number format of the tick labels. You can see that the major ticks on our graph are spaced out every 20 y units, and the first one occurs at y equals 20. So our major ticks start at 20, then 40, then 60, 80, and 100. If we leave the interval at 20, but change the first tick so that it starts at y equals 10, we would expect the ticks to occur at 10, then 30, 50, 70, 90, and 110. Let's try it. We'll click Apply, and indeed, that's what we see. However, now, in my own opinion, the graph looks a bit more cluttered and harder to read, so let's change it back to an interval of 20 and starting at y equals 20. We can also add minor ticks to our axis. Because each major tick is 20 y units apart, we can add minor ticks and we'll select 4, indicating that each major tick is comprised of 4 minor ticks, and click Apply. The resulting minor ticks would each represent a step size of 20 divided by 4, or 5 y units for each minor tick. You can compare the location of these minor ticks with the mean values of each bar to confirm this step size if you'd like. We can also make changes to the format of the axis values, changing, for example, the values from decimal to scientific notation or other format, manually changing the number of decimal places shown, or adding a prefix or suffix to each value. For example, let's add a % sign as a suffix. Let's see how that looks. One final and very useful feature on the axis tabs is the ability to create custom tick marks and grid lines on the graph. For our data, we had chosen our baseline to occur at y equals 50, as you can see in the graph. If we wanted to add a custom grid line at y equals 50 to represent this, we could do this by entering a value of 50 under y equals, checking the boxes for tick and grid line, and adding the text baseline. You also have the option to show any additional custom tick marks in addition to regular tick marks, to show only custom ticks instead of regular ticks, or to show only regular ticks. We will choose to show our custom ticks with regular ticks and click Apply. You can see that the text label is a bit crowded in this orientation, and you may not like the pattern for the line that was used. To address these issues, we can click on the Details button, which will take you to an advanced dialog for formatting your custom ticks and grid lines. I won't go into all of the detail on this dialog, but briefly, we can change the text location to left horizontal and change the line style to a solid line. This dialog also provides ways for you to customize tick styles and to add area fill between two ticks or between ticks and axes. For now, we'll just click OK. and then OK again, to see our cleaned up custom tick, grid line, and label. Just like with axes titles, custom grid line labels can be moved. Let's move this one to the right side of the graph. Our graph now looks pretty good. Let's reopen the Format Axes dialog one last time. The last tab of the Format Axes dialog is the Titles and Fonts tab. This tab is mostly self-explanatory, but gives you a very precise control over which titles are or aren't shown on the graph, their exact positions on the graph, and direct control over each font and font size individually for both graph and axis titles, as well as for axis numbers and labels. Through a combination of these various tools and options in the Format Axes dialog that we explored in this video, as well as the Format Graph dialog and other customization options explored in the other videos in this series, the possible number of ways to customize and personalize your graphs is virtually limitless. Using these tools, you can specifically highlight the important aspects of your research, exhibiting in clear and understandable ways the main findings of your work in a way that you think will be most effective. Thanks for watching.